Thank you for tuning in to this first episode of Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandan Das, and this podcast will be exploring the mystical literatures of ancient India. We will discuss the wonderful stories that can be found in the Puranas and Mahabharata and Ramayana, as well as the philosophical teachings found in the works like the Vedanta Sutra and the Upanishads. And we'll begin with an introduction to the Vedic literatures and sort of the history of their creation and what they are, and then we'll take a deeper look at that most magnificent of Vedic literatures, the Bhagavad Purana. So I'd like you to stretch your imagination far back into time, before the ancient Sumerians dug their waterways along the Tigris and Euphrates, before ancient Egypt sprang up along the banks of the Nile. There was ancient India. The ancient Indians saw their land as very special. It was a sacred place, a religious place, just as one may find temples or mosques or churches throughout the world that are dedicated towards the pursuit of spiritual knowledge and towards God. So similarly, the land of India itself is considered like a temple upon the earth, a wellspring of spiritual knowledge. In fact, the ancient texts call this land Aryavart, or the land of the Aryans. Aryans meaning those who know the value of human life and are thus striving upwards in spiritual realization and following a particular culture of spiritual purity and practice. So ancient India is very much a land in which one takes birth in order to pursue spiritual practices. In particular, this Aryavart was understood to spread from the Sarasvati River, which is gone, it's dried up, but it used to exist along the borders of Pakistan and the Punjab in India, and stretch all the way across northern India along the Ganges plain, where the Jamuna River also flows, and all the way into Bengal. And it is a land where the spotted antelope lives. In fact, that is one way in which these texts defined this sacred land as being the place where you can find the spotted antelope. So, as a sage or rishi, say you're wandering around this land, as long as you see the sacred antelope, you understand that you're in a holy land. And they were discouraged from wandering outside of it. This was an agricultural society living very simply in harmony with nature. In fact, most people just lived in small villages scattered throughout the plains or along the sacred rivers. And there was no modern technology, obviously, no cars, no planes, no trains, no noise. And the people lived mostly in huts. And their transportation was, oftentimes their feet or bullock carts pulled by bulls. And although they did have the opulence of golden jewelry and they dressed very nicely, they weren't so much absorbed in gathering wealth. Rather, their wealth was the purity of the water, the purity of the air, the quality of the food, fresh fruits, fresh grains and vegetables taken from the field. And also harmonious relationships, nice big families, very loving, very kind, very unified together. It's just like, for example, right now it is Christmas time while making this podcast. And you see that people come together in their families once a year, and they try to enjoy each other's association. And, it'd be very nice if families could shut off the television and shut off all the modern conveniences and just sort of sit together and talk and enjoy with each other. And in order to do that, you have to have very strong, harmonious relationships that take a long time to cultivate and that require a culture to cultivate. So similarly within the Vedic culture, there is this strong culture which cultivates good relationships which become a source of pleasure and happiness. So this was considered wealth in this culture. The ability to love your neighbor as well. Individuals treated each other very nicely according to strict religious codes. And it was a monarchical society, but ultimately the leaders of the society were considered enlightened sages. In fact, it's very interesting that the leaders of society were considered the sannyasis, and they were mendicants who traveled from door to door begging from the people. And in reciprocation for whatever fruits and grains would be given to them, they would hold out their cloth, sort of like their shirt, and they would hold it out in front of them, and whatever people put in it, they would be satisfied, much like a monk, sort of begging for food. And in reciprocation, they would gradually develop relationships with people and then encourage them in their spiritual life and also help them in their family life and in general try to become their friend. So these were the true leaders of society, and even the monarchs were under their guidance. So this is very much a religious society. And over and above all, you had these very powerful rishis that were present. These are individuals of immense power, because as one meditates and develops themselves spiritually, as a natural byproduct, one develops mystic powers, psychic powers, abilities to control nature. And so occasionally through these beautiful agrarian farmlands and jungles, you would have these extremely powerful sages and rishis who are wandering about. And so this is where our story begins. This is over 5,000 years ago. There's a great sage within the Vedic literatures known as Parashara Muni. He's very famous as a speaker of the Vishnu Purana, as well as the astrological text, the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, which is the main text of Indian or Vedic astrology. And so as this sage is walking through the farmlands and the forests, he recognizes or understands that there's a powerful astrological formation that is arriving. And this astrological formation or conjunction of the planets has the potential to bring into the world a greatly powerful spiritual person who will be a light to the world, who will benefit the world greatly. And in his wandering, he comes to the broad banks of the Jamuna River, and there Parashara finds a fisherman named Dusharaj, who's ferrying people across the river in his boat. Now the fisherman is a little busy, so he asks his daughter, a young beautiful woman, to ferry this great sage across the river. Now she's peculiar in one way. Her name is Matsya Gandha, which means in Sanskrit smells like a fish. And as a fisherman's daughter, she has this sort of fish smell. In fact, the legends say that the fisherman had actually found her within the belly of a fish that he had caught. So taking this baby from the belly of a fish, he raised her as his own, but she always had this fish smell. But nevertheless, she was very, very beautiful and also very intelligent. So Matsya Gandha asked the sage Parashara to enter her father's boat, and then, taking the stick, she pushes the boat from the shore and they begin to move across the river. And in the midst of the river, the great sage Parashara presented Matsya Gandha with a very unusual request. He said that I am the great sage Parashara, and at this very rare astrological moment, there's the opportunity for a great soul to come into this world. So would you like to come together with me, and we can consummate a relationship, and I will give you this child? And as unusual as this request is, seeing the opportunity to have a child with this incredibly powerful sage, the fisherman's daughter, Matsya Gandha, said yes. And so instead of ferrying him across the river, she brought them to a small island within the midst of the river. And there the great sage, by his mystic power, he caused a deep, dense fog, an impenetrable fog, to flow all around the river and surround the island so no one can see. And taking the sage from the boat, Matsya Gandha brought him to a very secluded place on the island, and then she expressed her concern. She said that you're a great sage, and I have this problem that my entire body smells like fish. Not only am I the daughter of a fisherman, but I've had this upon me like a curse from my very childhood. And so Parashara immediately blessed her with the power that she would smell very beautifully. In fact, she smelled like musk. And this smell was so strong that she afterwards was known as Yojana Gandha, which means you can smell her from a yojana, or like 8 miles away. So it's almost like as you approach, even from a great distance, this woman, your nostrils fill with a wonderful sort of perfume, a very exotic perfume. And as you get closer, it smells greater and greater and greater. So she sort of has like a natural perfume. She doesn't have to apply it at all. And not only that, but he blessed her that she would remain eternally youthful. And so she'd always be very beautiful as she was then. He also blessed the child that would come from the union, giving her all assurances that he would be a great personality within the world, endowed with all good qualities and powers. And this woman, Matsyagandha, or Yojana Gandha, she was also known by the name Satyavati, which means truthful. And she would later become a prominent person, a queen, within the epic story, the Mahabharata. And her son, he would become the progenitor of the dynasty, which is at the center of that story. And the child was born on that island, and his name was Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, or Vyasadeva. So Krishna, meaning dark, because his complexion was very dark. And then Dvaipayana means born on an island, or a dvipa in Sanskrit. And Vyas means divider, or someone who divides something, cuts it up into pieces. And so this refers to his primary task within the world, which was to divide up the Vedas and to sort of categorize them and to spread them within human society. And he's generally referred to with the reverential title Vyasadeva. And Vyasadeva is considered what is called a Shaktivesh avatar, or an avatar of God, or Vishnu, meaning he's an incarnation, but he's not directly God. He's an empowered person. He's a soul, a regular individual just like you and me, and yet sort of the power of God comes down into him and gives him the strength to perform a superhuman task. And this task is to take the Vedas and to codify them and to write them down, and then to disseminate them for various spiritual schools into the human society. And the Vedas describe that just as the world moves in cycles, such as the cycle of the seasons, there's spring, there's summer, there's fall, there's winter, then spring. So similarly, the consciousness of human society moves in cycles that expand vast periods of time. It begins with a Satya Yuga, a time of pure spiritual consciousness, and then gradually devolves into the Dvapara Yuga, where the consciousness becomes a little more materialistic, and then into the Treta Yuga, where the consciousness becomes quite a bit more materialistic, and then finally, as it enters into the Kali Yuga, there's a time of great materialism and spiritual ignorance and darkness and difficulty and struggle. And this age of Kali, or this time of materialism, is relatively short compared to the others, but it's an intense experience of unhappiness and misery. And then as this age of Kali reaches its most intense point, then the age of Satya Yuga, or the first age, starts again, and there's sort of a spiritual rebirth in the consciousness of mankind, and the cycle continues. And as mentioned, these extend over long periods of time. If you were to look at, say, a clock face, which also moves in a cycle, and you look at the minute hand, so when the minute hand is at 12 o'clock, say that's the beginning of Satya Yuga. Satya Yuga would go all the way until the minute hand is at 6 o'clock. So almost half of the entire cycle. The second age, or Dvapara Yuga, would then extend from 6 o'clock, say, to 9 o'clock. So another large portion of the clock. And then the third age, Treta Yuga, would then expand from 9 o'clock all the way to probably about 11 o'clock. And then finally, Kali Yuga is just between 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock. And according to this understanding of secular time and sort of the flourishing and gradual devolution of human consciousness, we live at around 11:15. We're understood to be in the beginning of Kali Yuga, meaning that Kali Yuga begins and there's sort of a strong influx of materialistic consciousness into the world and a great loss of spiritual knowledge. But it's still there at this time. Still, you can find spiritual knowledge, you can find an understanding of God, an understanding of the soul, and you can still develop it. But there's a strong struggle against gross spiritual ignorance. And as time goes on and on and on, gradually the materialism, the sort of spiritual darkness will win out. It'll overwhelm all spiritual knowledge. And it's predicted that after about another 5,000 years or so, then religion within the world will practically completely disappear. And the people will become more and more vicious. And the suffering of human society will grow more and more intense. And then after a very long period of time, as human society reaches that sort of midnight, that 12 o'clock point, then it's absolute spiritual darkness. And the Vedic literatures go into great detail describing what that looks like and how people are living. and it's not pretty. And then it describes, as the clock hand reaches 12 o'clock, a very beautiful sort of scent of sandalwood blows from the east, and there's sort of a spiritual rebirth all throughout the world, and the children of the people living at that time take birth in pure consciousness. And during the Satya Yuga, or this purest age, the Bhagavad Purana describes that the people are essentially sages. They're essentially rishis. There's not much society. There's not many buildings. Even villages aren't very common. The people live very, very simply, essentially as rishis or seers, living in the woods and meditating. So whatever humans are there at that time, they don't develop economics very much, or politics or anything like that. They just kind of live in spiritual community, sort of out in the woods, and their primary concern is meditating. And at that time, the Vedas are manifested as the Om. I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with Om. So that sort of sacred vibration, which encompasses the vibration of the universe, both spiritual and material, that's at the center of their practice. So basically you have a world filled with sages and rishis living very simply, practically speaking, eating only the fruits of the trees and absorbed in spiritual consciousness, very much like the Garden of Eden. They live very peacefully and simply, absorbed in their spiritual meditation and raising their consciousness and chanting the Om. As time goes by and the Satya Yuga gradually transforms into the second age of the Dvapara Yuga, there's a slight tinge of materialism, and these sages and rishis who lived in their hills and hermitages and in their mountain caves, they come out of the forest and they start to practice sacrifice or fire sacrifice, offering grains such as barley and wheat into the sacred fire along with clarified butter and mantras. And so these sages who have been meditating upon the Om, the Vedas are vibrating eternally within the Om. It is the sum total of all vibration. And the Vedas are understood to be a spiritual vibration which exists, very similar to the concept of the Akashic records. It exists on a subtle level within the Om, and its origin is ultimately God, and it's there manifesting from at the very time of creation. And so these rishis, while absorbed in the Om, they're able to hear also the transcendental vibration of the Vedas, this purely spiritual vibration. And hearing it, then they're able to draw down and pull out of it certain aspects of that vibration, which then apply for the spiritual advancement of human society according to the consciousness of that society. So as the consciousness began to become slightly more materialistic, from the Omkar they drew that element of Vedic vibration which is the heart or the basis of a culture of sacrifice. And so sort of human society begins to change, and this fire sacrifice becomes the center of it. And therefore, the Veda, it becomes rather the Yajur Veda, which means the Veda of worship. And the Yajur Veda is essentially the handbook for performing these sacrifices. And it has within it 4 divisions, Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva, which are meant to be used by the 4 different types of priests which perform the sacrifice together. And as time goes on, gradually, little more and more materialism enters into human society, and we enter into the third age, the Treta Yuga. In previous to now, human society had lived as essentially as a priesthood, absorbed in sacrifice. But now the materialism has grown to where there are other sorts of occupations which are needed. And the Vedas, again, from sort of the rishis, pull out of them an entire structure of human society which will facilitate the various needs and desires of society as it becomes more materialistic. And it is at that time that the 4 social orders and spiritual orders of society are created. And we'll talk about that more in the future. But essentially, human society is structured into 4 different classes. You have a priestly class, you have a administrative and warrior class, then you have a mercantile and farming class, and then finally a laboring class. And also, human society is meant to pass through 4 different stages of life. There's the stage of being a student, and then the stage of sort of having a family and being married, and the stage of sort of entering into old age and gradually becoming detached from the world, and then finally a stage of full spiritual renunciation and absorption. And there's an entire culture which surrounds this, and the details of that culture can be found in books such as the Manu Samhita. And so essentially human society in its full structured form with its various occupations and stages of life, it comes into manifestation at that time. And there's a deeply religious culture which structures human society to function in a way in which those same spiritual values, as we found in the previous ages, are still maintained. And at that time also you'll find that the religious process changes, and the primary form of worship shifts from sacrifice, performing these fire sacrifices, and the priesthood surrounding it, to the worship of deities within the temples, or spiritual sacred images. So you'll find the building of these temples proliferates, and people are absorbed in performing ritual temple worship. And it was into this time period that Vyasadeva was born. And he could see the oncoming of Kali Yuga, the age of materialism, wherein darkness overwhelms spiritual knowledge. And he wanted to develop a system wherein the Vedic culture that existed could extend into Kali Yuga as far as possible before being overwhelmed. And the goal of this podcast is to then take these Vedic literatures, as many as exist today, and the culture surrounding them, and to really open them up and try to understand them and to gain light from them. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.